Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a weekly show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, Oz. I'm here in Melbourne. I'd love to be able to sort of tell people, like, sell this thing of like we're these two friends doing this together, like always hanging out. But I haven't seen you yet.
No, the logistics have not worked. You know, we had such great feedback to our last recording that we did in person. We kind of got a bit intimidated by it. We thought, fuck, we can't really do that again. What if it doesn't live up? So even though you're geographically as close to me as you've been for months, still far enough away to do this recording remotely for some reason.
You promise we're getting lunch or a beer this week?
We can do a beer. I don't know if I want to commit to a full meal with you.
A full meal with me? Our lives have been based on having meals together. What is this?
That's true. We've had some fantastic meals together in our time.
I think this friendship was kindled getting lunch at the ABC. I think that it's an essential ingredient. Anyway.
Shout out Willis Canteen in Ultimo. One of the best Indonesian joints that city has ever seen.
The best.
Hey Scott, we'll figure out our lunchtime schedules after this recording. There's been some very big media news this week, just the past couple of days. One of the most fascinating media power struggles that's been playing out behind closed doors over the last couple of years, it's finally resolved, it seems like. The future of the biggest and most influential media company in the world, including Australia, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, appears to have finally been settled. And people might know that this power struggle was the inspiration for HBO's Succession, one of the most critically acclaimed TV shows of the past, I guess, half a decade or decade, and also one of the most critically acclaimed shows that you, Scott Mitchell, have never seen. What's going on with that?
Oh my God. I sensed in the run-up that you were going to put me on blast about this and put me on the spot. Yes, I know. It's like everything that I enjoy, and I still haven't watched it. I can't defend it. I don't know what to say. Yes, you're right.
So the real life power struggle has been between Rupert Murdoch and his son Lachlan. They're on kind of one side of this, and then there are the children from his first two marriages, the others, Elizabeth, Prue, and James, who are kind of on the other side of this battle. It's a corporate power play. It's a political one. A lot of people have messaged me in the last couple of days and said, Oz, I saw Lachlan is kind of involved. Which one is he? Is he a Kendall? Is he a Roman? It's not a one for one. It's funny because Kendall, the main Succession son, played by Jeremy Strong. Scott, for your benefit.
I have seen 2 episodes. I'm vaguely familiar with the archetypes.
He's kind of like a hybrid of Lachlan and James, so it doesn't really map into a one-for-one comparison. But basically, Scott, tell us a bit about what has happened here, who is succeeding this company, and what does it all mean?
Yeah, so Lachlan is the successor, and interestingly, Rupert Murdoch sort of chose Lachlan a couple of years ago already. In 2023, Rupert stepped back as executive chair running the day-to-day operations and installed Lachlan, who's his oldest son, as the executive chair of the two companies that the Murdochs run their empire through, Fox Corporation and News Corp. But even though he was Rupert's chosen one, what's been decided in this settlement is that Lachlan was chosen by Rupert, but when Rupert dies, the shares would be inherited by this family trust that all the kids have a stake in, and basically the other Murdoch children could have ousted the anointed successor if they all ganged up. So this deal basically is really Rupert and Lachlan versus the other kids, and they've managed to do a deal that smooths the transition, gives Rupert his chosen successor, the oldest son, to take over. And to me, Lachlan is a pretty fascinating person, particularly for Australians. His story is pretty tied to Fox News, and so a lot of reporting, particularly by Americans, kind of assumes he represents this American shift in the Murdochs, right? They really don't visit Australia very much anymore, aren't that involved. And that's true to an extent, but Actually, I would say out of all of the children who kind of could have been the successor, if you put it in the succession frame, like he is the one with the strongest connection to Australia still. His wife Sarah is obviously Australian. When he fell out with his father for a long time and chose to exile himself from the family, he could have settled anywhere in the world. He's a billionaire, but he chose to settle in Sydney for years. He gets quite emotional talking about Australia.
No wonder you like him so much. You guys have a mutual adoration for the great city of Sydney.
Well, yeah, exactly. I don't know if I would say I like him a lot, but I guess like what I mean is like, and I think you can like see this, that when the company had to cut a bunch of jobs at the Australian and Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun last year, Lachlan flew out from New York to personally oversee that redundancy process. And it shows, I think, that he cares. And I guess what I mean by that is like, I think that with Lachlan at the helm, we are still going to see this Australian streak in News Corp's global operations. Like, we're still going to see right-wing Australian commentators get kind of like picked up by the US, put on Fox News. You're still going to see a lot of Australian staff, I think, go over there to help run operations. I think that's not done with Lachlan taking over.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. And the other dynamic to this has been, Lachlan, the reason why Rupert wanted him to inherit the company is because he sees Lachlan as more ideologically aligned to him.
Totally.
He sees Lachlan as another kind of right-wing figure. Some people close to Lachlan say that he's even more right-wing than Rupert. I mean, I think that's quite terrifying to think about. What I think has been fascinating the last couple of years is this battle between the children has been playing out, and there's been some great reporting from the New York Times in particular covering this like legal case over the trust in this Reno courtroom in Nevada in America. What's been really interesting is that the three other children have sort of been portraying themselves, particularly James, as, we're the woke ones. We want to wrest control of this company from Rupert and from Lachlan so we can stop the destruction that Fox News is kind of wreaking on America.
And got so very into environmentalism and stuff. And yeah.
Totally. And a lot of American liberals in particular have been like, yes, James is going to come and he's going to save Fox News, he's going to stop Trump. Turns out like that was probably all just a bit of negotiating and a bit of leverage. That the children have settled for $1.1 billion US. That has effectively bought them out of the company. And so they're fine. They'll do whatever they want to do with their billions. James used to have a rap label, so it'll be interesting to see whether or not he wants to get back into the music business. Prue, I think, just lives on a farm in Australia, and Elizabeth has like a production company. So they've got their $1 billion of like Murdoch blood money that they're just going to do whatever they want with. And the future of Fox, the future of News Corp, which includes like the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Australian, the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Courier Mail, the Adelaide Advertiser, all of these newspapers. And like you say, Lachlan seems to be very interested in Australia. That will continue on this kind of right-wing trajectory.
Yeah, I think that's dead right. I think it's fascinating that it's like, actually, at the end of the day, did they want to take the old man's empire and turn it for good? No, they were hustling to get the best settlement they could. The one story I thought I'd just quickly tell for people that might be interested about how big kind of Australia and Australian culture plays a role in the Murdoch family and even in their US operations is, actually, I alluded to it, but when Lachlan and his dad fell out, they didn't speak for years. That fallout happened because Lachlan was put into Fox News at its very early stages. And there was this kind of power struggle between Lachlan and a guy people might have heard of, Roger Ailes, who's kind of credited as the godfather of Fox News. And they were kind of in this power struggle over control of Fox News. And it all came down, Oz, to a debate over what to put in like the prime time slot at like 6:37. Roger Ailes wanted to poach this American TV host Geraldo Rivera. What did Lachlan want to do instead? He wanted to bring to America the tried and true format of A Current Affair. And people might realize who won out in that is Rupert basically chose Roger Ailes over his own son. Lachlan was furious that he, would pick Ailes over him and sent himself into exile, basically, in frustration at his dad's decision. But that just shows how, like, Australian ideas can reach over into America through the Murdochs. And also, like, what a sliding doors moment. Imagine if, instead of, like, birthing the MAGA movement, Fox News was like chasing dodgy neighbors and like plumbers around America. It would be incredible. So
it's really interesting. It's really interesting. I was listening to some US commentary about this morning, and I guess I hadn't really kept up to like the ratings and stuff. Fox News is now the biggest channel in America, and it outrates, like, it's a cable channel, so you got to pay to have it, but it outrates now like the free broadcast networks in the US. It's the only cable channel whose audience is actually growing. And so when you combine that with Rupert's political alliance with Trump, and the way that Trump is like picking people like Pete Hegseth from Fox News to be his defense secretary, like the power and influence this media company still has is extraordinary. And last week, Scott, you went deep on Sky News, another Rupert Murdoch-owned company. It's just like, we can talk about it all the time and probably bore ourselves and our listeners, but on the other hand, you kind of can't overstate the influence that Rupert Murdoch, now Lachlan Murdoch, and News Corp has on politics, media, culture, society, everything, are all around the world.
Totally. Absolutely.
All right, Scott, today on the show, nearly 2 weeks on from the far-right March for Australia protests, Australia's political debate is very hyper-focused on immigration, with the Liberal Party in particular locked in on a brawl over exactly how much they hate Indian migrants. And the one thing that stood out to you and I on all of this is just how utterly unequipped the Australian media seems to be to report on issues of race and racism, and that becomes a pretty big problem when it's the biggest story in the country. So we're going to take a look at the way politicians are weaponizing immigration, how that's being reported, and whether the usual media tactics of fact checks and explainers are of any use when dealing with an emboldened racist far-right movement in the country. Also on the show, we're going to examine the dire state of arts and culture journalism in Australia, with recent cuts at major Australian media outlets, cuts at smaller and independent outlets as well, and now the closure of the 85-year-old literary journal Meanjin, resulting in fewer and fewer places where critics can be published. Things looking pretty damn grim. But maybe, Scott, in all of this bloodshed, there is opportunity. So we're going to see if we can chart a slightly more positive path forward.
Looking forward to that. And in keeping tabs, triple killer Erin Patterson was sentenced to life in prison this week, Oz, but will be eligible for parole in 33 years, with the sentencing judge specifically talking about the intense media coverage of the case and how that impacted his sentencing remarks. We'll discuss if the media has learned anything from the whole sordid ordeal, Oz.
And Scott, news influencers like Cheek Media are adamant they are not journalists. But what happens when they try to do journalism and end up doing it quite badly? Like a case of suggesting an Australian travel influencer who recently went to Afghanistan was in fact paid for by the Taliban. It kind of raises all sorts of thorny questions about where people get their news and the responsibility of incredibly popular and influential podcasts to accuracy. And I can't wait to discuss the ongoing tensions between journalism and the news media influencer ecosystem. Our researcher Izzy has actually written a really fascinating piece on this topic. Our subscribers got it in their inbox on Wednesday, but you can subscribe right now at lamestream.com.au to read it. And subscribing is also the best way to support what we do here on the podcast. And also, Scott, we have some big, exciting news about the future of the show, and we're going to share it at the end of today's episode.
Big announcement.
But first, Scott, take us to federal politics. Take us to Canberra.
Well, Oz, this week the biggest story in federal politics has obviously been Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who went on TV and said Indian migrants were being brought into the country by the Labor government as part of some political conspiracy to increase their vote. Every side of politics, every commentator in the country has had something to say about it. I want to get into that story, Oz, and kind of everything wrong with it and the way the media has reported it. But first, Oz, God, last week you spoke very well, I thought, about the way the far-right, white nationalist, neo-Nazis, part of their strategy is to force conversations about immigration into the mainstream. They want this topic being discussed. And that's something I also know, and I totally agree with you about. But I don't think I could have predicted just how bad the race and immigration conversation would have become only a few days after that conversation, just like a week and a half after those rallies. Whether it's the government, which said it was opposed to these rallies, or media organizations that editorialized against them, all of these institutions, like 10 days later, have allowed those rallies to shape the agenda. Everyone is talking about immigration. And it's kind of actually shocked me. But like, I don't know, did you see this coming?
Oh, did I see this coming? I mean, I've been thinking about for a long time how the Australian media ecosystem would deal with what we've seen in Europe and the US, particularly the UK and the US in the last couple of years, a real mainstreaming of pretty heinous, racist, far-right ideology. And a couple of things in the last couple of weeks, Scott, that made me really brace myself for what we're experiencing right now. Every year in Canberra, there's this thing called the Midwinter Ball. It's hosted by the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery, and it's like a charity event where politicians and journalists and, you know, kind of big company donors raise money for some cause, and they have a kind of Chatham House Rules event where politicians make jokes about one another, and all the journalists and politicians get to dress up and take photos and, you know, pretend they're at the White House, you know, correspondence dinner or whatever. And every year, it's really kind of confronting. You see all the different bureaus of all the different news organizations take photos on the steps of Parliament House and post them on Instagram and say how proud they are to be at this event. And it is astonishing to me how many of those photos contain either 100% just white journalists or like 95 to 99% just white journalists. I kind of think in an American context, even in a British context, you kind of couldn't get away with doing that. If news organizations were proudly celebrating how white they were in the way that Australian news organizations are, they would be like pilloried by everyone from politicians themselves to other parts of the media ecosystem to prominent commentators on this issue. But in Australia, no one else except probably us will even talk about it. So it's like one thing. And then I think the week after the Midwinter Ball, I actually went to Canberra. I was speaking at a conference there, which was awesome. I popped into Parliament House and chatted to a few politicians and journalists. And I used to work there. It was interesting to like run into some familiar faces. And again, I was just kind of blown away by how homogenous that building is. And it just, again, made me think this group of people live in a bubble very disconnected from the rest of Australia. And I think, I use this word at the top of the episode, are just like fundamentally unequipped to deal with basically anything to deal with race and racism in the country. So I don't know if I predicted how grim things were going to get, but I was bracing myself based on those little bits of evidence and anecdotes that I had.
Yeah, and I think like we've seen through like this Jacinta Price story and other things that have happened, like the way that bubble you're talking about then creates the kind of culture and the news agenda and everything that we all have to deal with. Yeah. And this Jacinta Price thing, I want to start with it because it's kind of the biggest news story. But like the first thing that's weird about it is that it actually happened on Wednesday of last week when Price went on the ABC's afternoon briefing with Patricia Karvelas to discuss immigration just like a few days after these rallies. And it only became a like really, really big story this week. Now, look, a lot of people will know Jacinta Price. She's like an Indigenous coalition senator from the Northern Territory. But unless you pay like close attention to politics, you might not know that she's like a leading figure in kind of the hard right wing of the coalition who takes a lot of cues from Trump and Trumpist politics. She's very close to Sky News and this lobby group called Advance Australia. But I just mean that to say it's very on brand for her to jump into the headlines on kind of race politics when this kind of moment post Marches for Australia is happening. So in some ways, kind of unsurprising, she said something inflammatory. Now, as a lot of news organizations talking about this story aren't really playing the grab of what she said about Indian migrants. It's a little long. It doesn't cut down neatly for news, but we're a podcast. And luckily, I think we can sort of play it so people know what we're talking about here.
Do you think they're actively running a migration program to bring people in that you think will be politically open to their ideas?
Absolutely. I mean, this is Labor. Basically, it's power at any cost, and we see that occur all over the place in terms of the way they conduct themselves. We see the way in which they like to influence the Indigenous community and remote communities, the influence of the unions. It's ultimately about power.
So who do you think they're trying to bring in to make them vote for Labor?
Well, those that are more Labor-leaning, that are likely to be...
But there are right-wing and left-wing people in every community, right? So who specifically are they?
Well, as we've seen, you yourself mentioned that there is a concern with the Indian community, and only because there's been large numbers, and we can see that reflected in the way that the community votes for Labor at the same time.
Immediately, Oz, this is a very, very worrying thing to be said by a politician. Like, I don't need to tell you that this has echoes of the Great Replacement theory, which is this conspiracy theory that we talked about in the last couple of episodes. It's this theory that inspired the Christchurch shooter to murder 51 people. And Price may not know that. She might be oblivious to the similarity in what she's saying to that theory. But if there's a white supremacist out there watching this, Oz, who believes in the conspiracy that basically, bonkers idea that governments are conspiring to replace white people and breed them out of existence to kind of secure their own power, it's easy to see how someone who is down that rabbit hole would see Price's comments as endorsing it. They might re-edit it. They could use that grab as propaganda. Look, we should say very quickly, Price kind of backtracked from her comments. She actually blamed Karvelis for pushing the issue and pushing her to talk about that, which, she might actually have a point on, but the point is, Price still said it. The rest of the coalition started saying the comments were wrong, but crucially, refused to apologize, which is weird in itself, to admit something's wrong but not apologize for it. But, it only really became a massive national story this week because Susan S.S. Ley went on
she's back.
She's back. Went on this rehabilitation tour with the Indian community, meeting a bunch of community leaders on Sunday, and that is when it became a really massive story. And here's where we get to the media, Oz. I woke up on Monday morning, and suddenly this went from a story that was bubbling away to front pages all over the country. Not because of how dangerous it is to court these ideas, not because of how racist it can be to accuse people of being here for some nefarious ulterior reason, not because of how racist it can be to say people vote a certain way because of their ethnicity. All of the reporting I saw framed Price's error as whether it was a tactical error or not for the coalition. How the coalition don't hold enough multicultural seats. Could this be an own goal for the coalition at the next election? The ABC News piece on it, quote, "Behind the scenes, Liberals are mortified and fear the work the party has done to win over one of Australia's largest and fastest growing diasporas has been undone in a matter of minutes." The Fin Review story in the Financial Review was actually headlined, "Australia's Indian community is growing fast, and it votes." Of course it votes! What? But it also pointed out that, the Indian community is really educated and they're overly represented in management roles. Great coalition voters, potentially. What?
Oh,
who cares? This is such a second order concern about what's so alarming about these comments. I just read all of this all this week and just thought, I was what happened to covering these comments as just wrong in and of themselves? Why can't journalists ask questions about whether these comments are dangerous, the accountability on that, Oz?
Yeah, if you've been following the way that the press gallery have been talking about the Chinese community for the last few years, some of this isn't super surprising because it's the same kind of language that demonstrates, I think, a real lack of knowledge and understanding about how all kinds of migrant communities operate, and this kind of bizarre framing of these strange people who've come and we don't really know how to pass them other than who do they potentially vote for. It's very confusing to a lot of people. And I think the other thing that is quite obvious to me is the way that the media, in their reluctance to really just say these are racist comments, are exposing themselves for double standards. Because imagine if any other senator said these kinds of comments about other communities. Like if a senator said literally what Jacinta Price said about the Jewish community, the entire media establishment would, like quite rightly, as they should be, about these comments about the Indian community, saying that they are racist dog whistling designed to demonize and attack a marginalized minority in Australia. Instead, we get these very odd framings purely looking at it through the lens of the political kind of analysis. You mentioned the Fin Review story, Scott. I actually think that was like a bit more nuanced than the others. It actually did something that so few political stories do on this topic. It reflected that there are different segments of the Indian community.
Totally.
And they vote in different ways. Younger Indians, second or third generations, vote different to older ones or recently arrived migrant groups. Indian Hindus have very different political views, particularly on, the role of the Modi government versus Indian Sikhs and Muslims, But look, that was one of very few exceptions. Largely, the way that this story has been covered, as you put, is I think atrocious. And there's this sense you get from so much of it, particularly the stuff coming out of Canberra. And this goes back to like just how much of a homogenous bubble that press gallery is. You just get the sense that so many of these journalists have never interacted with an Australian of Indian descent before. They keep discussing them in this weird monolithic way, and they're not, like we just discussed with what that Fin piece was trying to do. They are not just political units that should be viewed through the lens of how much of them vote for the Liberals and how much of them vote for Labor, and what does this mean for Susan S.S. Lee's attempts to build a workable, governing majority in Australian politics. The other interesting thing here, Scott, is how the focus on the Indian community became part of like the national debate around immigration. And really, I pinpointed this to the pollster Cos Samaras, who works for Redbridge Consulting. He went on a live stream with two very prominent anti-immigrant activists in Australia and said that his research showed that 85% of Indian Australians vote Labor. That then became a far-right talking point that fed into these rallies, and the Indian community became part of, like, as you put it, I think quite eloquently, a kind of localized version of this great replacement conspiracy theory. Labor is smuggling these people in, no one consented to it, they're demographically replacing us, and they're doing it to keep their numbers in Parliament. Now, that 85% figure kind of immediately set alarm bells for me, because that would make the Indian Australian community like the most politically homogenous bloc across like any demographic or group that like has ever existed in Australia. So I spoke to a few different experts on this, including Ben Rowie, who runs a tally room, someone I've mentioned before on the show. And there's just like no evidence for that number.
Wow.
Perhaps Cos has some research that he hasn't published yet. But in fact, a number of electoral experts do have figures, and they say the closest you can get, and it's not perfect because there's different data sets. There's the Australian electoral study, there's regression analysis you can do based on where Indian groups live in kind of seats in Sydney and Melbourne. The best, most accurate number you can get at is maybe like 60 to 65 of the two-party preferred vote for Labor. But that itself would be a very high watermark at the last federal election, which itself was like this big landslide to the Albanese government. So this, again, there's just this data point floating around that I just think needs to be fact-checked and corrected. But on the other hand, man, it kind of doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter how much Indian Australians vote Labor or don't. The attack on them is like pure racism. It's not about the actual percentage of votes. That's just an argument that the far right are using as a bit of a cudgel. Like the Liberal Party, in condemning Price's comments, they're saying, look, we don't support this attack on Indian Australians. We just want there to be a really broad-based conversation about immigration that doesn't go to race or color or anything like that. But let's be very honest, man. Like the attacks on immigrants and the attacks on immigration are about very specific non-white communities. Like people say they're worried about housing. It is never like British backpackers in Bondi that get brought up. It's not British barbers coming in. Like they take up the same amount of housing as an Indian doctor or an Indian chef or whatever. But the focus always ends up being on migrant groups who come from non-European backgrounds. I think just really important to just be very explicit about that.
Definitely. And I think to go big picture, I think on what depressed me so much about this story, Oz, is like, it's an example of something we've spoken about before, which is like how much journalists today take their cues on stories from the bubble you described of federal politics. Like every media organisation, to go back to the March for Australia, for the last 2 weeks, I've seen them all calling it an anti-immigration rally. No one is saying far-right rally. I think us and other independent media are the only ones to use that like more robust language of far-right. And like, why aren't the media? Because the Prime Minister went on TV a couple of days later and said good people went and it was only hijacked by neo-Nazis. And so suddenly, like, we're not using that. And
That's
what
a really good
happened,
point.
like, to journalists being able to trust their own eyes? Like, the entire speaking list at those rallies around the country were littered with people using white supremacist talking points. Those speaker lists are stronger evidence of what happened than anything some politician says in an interview, but the media is like stuck in this insane rubric of following politicians' descriptions. So again, in this Jacinta Price story, the media is stuck in like this insane rubric of whether or not it's sensible for the coalition to do this, because that's what politicians are speaking about. I mean, like, who cares? And like, you know, like, shout out to Isabella Higgins wrote a good piece on some of this for the ABC. But apart from that, it is just so depressing. And I just feel like it's a sign of like a decline of the whole profession and the talent in it, that no one can step outside the bubble of like the daily news bites of what politicians think the issue at stake is. No journalist can step outside that and cover it with like some moral clarity about what like race politics means for all of us and for society. And I'd be fascinated to hear what you think of this, but it just like made me think we're actually going backwards. Like, the 90s were a horrible time for race politics and immigration politics in this country, but John Howard was put under huge pressure when Pauline Hanson first emerged to like condemn her and distance himself from those politics. And he had to do it despite like clearly sending a wink and a nudge to that kind of stuff. He did like have to kind of do it. And now a federal Liberal senator is basically just saying the exact same thing Hanson would say. And like, the media is just like, is it a wise political strategy? Who knows? Like, maybe it's getting them in a bit of hot water. Like, what is just so far from like prosecuting, like, does this jeopardize like multicultural Australia and like our like safety and equal participation in society? Like,
I mean, it's relieving hearing you say this, because it makes me feel less crazy. And I think your point about, is it worse than the 90s? I think I've been thinking about that question for a while. I think it kind of undeniably is. I think, you know, I will never forgive Barack Obama for popularizing that phrase, you know, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. There is nothing inevitable about social progress, you know, and we can regress on all sorts of social, economic kind of issues of equality and justice. And I think, you know, look at the US winding back abortion rights as an example of how that can happen. I think race politics and an acceptance of multiculturalism and an acceptance of diversity is undeniably in the retreat. And I think that is happening in Australia. And I think, yes, within these big institutions, it's now, like the Liberal Party, it is now more welcome to say these kinds of things than it used to be 30 years ago. Mainstream media organizations, I genuinely do think, are less robust in their response to this than they used to be. I don't know exactly why that is, and it's sort of surprising to me. I think part of that is, you know, we've talked about how institutions like the ABC have been hollowed out and have shifted to the right. Newspapers like The Age and the SMH, which used to be kind of defenders of liberal ideas, are now run by ex-News Corp and ex-Daily Mail editors who probably don't care as much about standing up to these issues as editors would have in the 90s and the 2000s. I think there just is... And like the kind of direction that news organizations could have gone in by actually reflecting Australia would have given them more trust in the community, would have given them bigger audiences, and would have given them some experience and actual journalists in their newsrooms to push back against some of this. They kind of don't have that. These news organizations have become hollowed out just like the political parties have. So we've ended up in a situation that I think is less good than it was in the 90s. And I think the other comparison I've been thinking about is Cronulla back in 2005, you know, where locals, quote unquote, at Cronulla Beach organized themselves into a mob and yelled at Arab and just like anyone who was not Anglo-Saxon and told them to go back to where they came from, go back to the western suburbs. Over the weekend in Sydney at Bondi Beach, you know, when a group, Jews Against the Occupation, organized a pro-Palestine protest at Bondi, a big group of Zionist pro-Israel figures marched or protested and to oppose them. There was a counter rally. The SMH filmed them saying things like, "You don't belong here, go back to Lakemba," like a western suburb in Sydney with a high Arabic, Lebanese, Muslim population. There's been basically no backlash to that, man. Like, there's been no political backlash. There's barely been any media coverage of it. It's the same stuff that was being shouted at Cronulla. Like, seeing mobs at the beach yell racist stuff like that is really confronting. And I think Cronulla, at least, for all the problems the media had in actually stoking Cronulla, there was a lot of introspection about how we got to that point. Now this shit just happens and it gets egged on by the media or ignored. And I think that is really depressing.
Yeah, and look, the last point I wanted to talk about with you, Oz, and to me maybe it's like the most important because it kind of covers all of the stories that you've mentioned and we've just talked about, is that sort of to revisit something we talked about last time. We talked about like the difference between platforming people to spout racist propaganda and doing journalism that holds people to account and pushes back on that. Everything that's happened since made me want to talk about, I think, another distinction, which is that I do think there's a difference between good and bad fact-checking. And what I mean by that is I think, like, for journalists, even who think they are doing the right thing, it's become almost like this default to go like, oh, well, I'm going to do a good job covering the far right because I'm going to fact-check their claims. And this leads to, like, a lot of pieces with headlines like, anti-immigration protesters say Australia's migration is at record highs, but the figures tell a different story. Like, that to me, Oz, is first of all kind of pointless. Like, the far right is not making a logical argument. They are using BS, stuff they know is nonsense about immigration to make a moral argument against people who aren't white. Like, so fact-checking them with ABS data on immigration is pointless. This is propaganda. No one cares or is going to, like, think differently about this stuff. Secondly, it can actually be damaging, I would argue, because it fills our news pages and social media with all of this discussion about immigration. And suddenly, like, we're all in their paradigm, the far right's paradigm, and there isn't some neat it's like if we're suddenly discussing immigration levels, it's like, oh, well, immigration is actually at a good level to maintain the white ethno-state. Like, there's not like, what is the good, like, it's you're countering a kind of like argument of like on morals with this like technocratic fact-checking. To me, good fact-checking and good pushback is when you take it as an issue of morality, when the fact checks that kind of prove what their strategies are, expose the way these people manipulate their audience, tells people about like any illegality or like shady ways that they fund their operations. That is good fact checking because it's like on a moral level. Doing this kind of stuff, I just don't know if it helps us.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think, and sorry to kind of just hammer this point home, I think it just shows the press gallery in particular, but all kinds of journalists in Australia have a very specific set of tools and they just deploy them again and again. And there are some instances where those tools make no sense. Like you gave some examples. There's a story in The Guardian in this sort of vein that was headlined, "Those angry about migration figures are ignoring what happened in Australia during COVID and other key facts." The Age, "A migration breather might sound appealing, but economically it's a shocker." Like, those pieces, if you read them without any other context, they're fine factual pieces. But to your point, it completely misunderstands, one, the motivations of the people making these arguments, like they're not in good faith, and two, how you're falling into the trap of talking about the one thing they want us all to talk about. We talked about in more detail last week. Like, the far right are celebrating in Telegram chats how they've managed to make the entire media ecosystem talk about issues of immigration. And it's like saying in the 30s, right, in the lead up to, not even in the lead up to Hitler, but when Hitler's about, 5 facts about how Hitler's wrong and how Jews don't actually control the banks and the media, and like why that's a factually inaccurate thing to say. Like, no shit. The basis of fascism is not a rational, logical, technocratic response. It's a hate-filled, divisive response. And that same thing is happening now. And I just don't think the kind of centrist brains in the Australian media establishment can grapple with that.
Very good take. I'm depressed that we completely agree about how doomed it is. Oh my
I know, this should be one where, like, you know, one of us is like, oh, you know, but there's like good pockets of stuff going on. But, you know, I guess this one is really serious. It's concerning both of us. And sometimes you can't sugarcoat this stuff.
Totally.
Much less depressing topic coming up after the break is going to look at how the Australian media is slowly and steadily degrading arts and culture journalism and why we think that matters.
I guess like a bunch of people losing their jobs is less depressing than like the descent into fascism, but like not exactly a happy subject.
Scott, a little while ago on this show, we discussed the latest wave of redundancies to hit the ABC. And one bit of that I wanted to highlight was cuts to the art. You know, they've now actually taken effect from kind of this month. There is no standalone specific arts team at the ABC. That's despite that being something specifically mentioned in the ABC's charter. The ABC's also gotten rid of some of the best and most experienced arts journalists in the country. These are people who would cover everything from visual arts to pop culture. They do it on TV, radio, and online. That's the stuff that ABC managers say they want their journalists to do. Now, for me personally, this is like very sad. I used to host the ABC's arts TV show, The Mix. I went on to develop the ABC's digital strategy for entertainment and culture. Seeing all of that just like cut back is like pretty depressing.
Totally.
But one thing that surprised me is when those cuts, particularly to the arts, were announced and in fact broken by us, there was basically no other follow-up coverage. Like, you would imagine that outlets like The Guardian, the Nine papers like The Age would have been interested in covering these drastic changes to the broadcaster, but they kind of just didn't do it. And I don't really know why, Scott, but it did get me thinking about the state of arts journalism and arts coverage in Australia more broadly. While I was doing that, late last week, Crikey broke the news that Meanjin, the 85-year-old literary magazine published by the University of Melbourne, was being shut down. Now, Meanjin did heaps more than just arts coverage, but it was a place where so many writers and reviewers found a home. It had a steady editing hand. It developed skills of like young and upcoming writers. It sparked pretty interesting intellectual debates. I personally was lucky enough to be published there a few times over the past decade. And that news itself came on top of the fact that the big issue, the kind of newspaper sold by people experiencing homelessness, that's getting rid of its arts editors. It's cutting back its reviews. And in the past year, the Nine papers have also had redundancies that have led to a pullback in how much they cover the arts. So I wanted to kind of talk about this issue because it seems like a pretty important inflection point. And I also want to talk about like why we should care about it and whether we think there's anything green shoots wise coming down the pipeline. But before we get into that, let's talk about the Meanjin news specifically, because that is a pretty fascinating media story.
Yeah, the Meanjin news is bizarre. Like, the board of Melbourne University Publishing announced it was shutting down the journal and making like its very small part-time editorial team redundant because the journal wasn't financially viable. Like, it's never been financially viable. It's an arts journal. Like, most arts journals aren't. That's the entire point. And I feel like I almost want to explain this, Oz, because modern culture has so, like, embraced this idea that everything has to have, like, a very clear balance sheet rationale that people have literally forgotten how the world used to work. Like, it wasn't that long ago that, like, places like universities, book publishers, media companies, philanthropists, they did things like Meanjin for all the other benefits, like fostering talent they could work with down the track, bolstering their reputations, building like loyalty and community around what they do. But like all these organizations have been taken over by boards stacked with bankers who are frankly morons and just apply like banking logic to a sector like culture. But anyway, I was like, I want to ask you, this Meanjin cut, like the way it's been announced has led to all this speculation that there's like other issues at play. Actually, and like you'd normally expect if something's being shut down, like, let's see if we can fundraise for it. Let's see if we can get more donors. Like, none of that seemed to happen. So, like, is there something else going on here, Oz?
Scott, the thing is we don't know, and I'm going to talk about some of the speculation, but I just want to preface it by saying, like, what we try to do here is, like, report things that we know, right? And there's a lot of speculation and suggestions that there are certain things happening behind the scenes. We're kind of trying to figure that out ourselves. So I will discuss some of the speculation, but I just want to make it very clear that we haven't really been able to firm up anything extremely specific other than what the organization has said itself, the Melbourne University Publishing, which is the organization that published Meanjin, which, as you said it was because it wasn't financially viable. Part of the reason we don't know anything is that apparently the staff at Meanjin have been forced to sign NDAs as part of their exit from the organization, which already is kind of an interesting thing. It's that's not a normal thing to happen unless there's something that, someone doesn't want us to know. I'm pretty curious why MUP wanted that to happen. And also, to be honest with you, man, I'm also interested in why the staff agreed to that. Presumably that was part of termination payments. But, I mean, it seems like something of this magnitude should really be well ventilated publicly. And look, there is speculation that the magazine was shut down because of the editorial line that it has taken on Palestine. In particular, it published an article very critical of the most prominent pro-Israel lobby groups in Australia, an article by Max Kaiser last spring. People have pointed to the fact that the head of the Melbourne University Council is Mark Liebler, the current chair of the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council, one of the biggest pro-Israel Zionist lobby groups. Now, Melbourne University Publishing denies that there's any connection and that the council was not aware of this and it was a decision taken totally independently by them. But honestly, in the absence of any other clarification of what is going on and how quick and rushed this thing has been, it really isn't surprising that people are making those links, and that is where the speculation is going. And, there may be a lot of people listening who maybe have heard of Meanjin or haven't even heard of Meanjin, might be wondering what the big deal is about this. One, aside from any political motivations that may emerge behind the closure of the magazine, it actually had a track record of being a home for so many very prominent Australian writers, artists, poets, and critics. And without it, that's just one less place for arts journalism to be published in Australia. And so why does that matter more broadly? I think this is a good time to kind of just zoom out and talk about why we need these institutions and why we need arts journalism in Australia. And the first reason, Scott, is one that applies specifically to Meanjin, as well as to so many other journals and newspapers. The best authors, the best writers, the best poets, the best artists, they don't emerge fully formed, ready to pump out an amazing novel or an amazing poetry collection. Most of the time, historically, they've been published in newspapers or literary journals first, whether it's fiction, whether it's non-fiction, whether it's a review, whether it's a poem, whatever. That's how this happens. And Meanjin itself used to publish authors like Patrick White, who was still the only Australian to win a Nobel Prize for Literature, published acclaimed poets like Les Murray, and more recently, one of the most celebrated poets of the last few years, the Indigenous poet Ellen van Neerven. So not having a place where people can actually publish their work really limits the experience writers can get. And without the kind of guidance of editors helping them along the way, it's kind of very unclear what will replace that and where we expect great Australian literature and kind of written art to emerge. It just sort of degrades so much of that coming out of the country. And I think the other aspect to having a very big, healthy, robust arts media ecosystem is the impact that interviews, profiles, and reviews can have, right? There's a few different parts of that. One is pretty obvious. Arts and culture journalism is how people figure out what to watch, what to go and see at the gallery, what to read, what album to listen to, what gig to go to, whether it's an exhibition or a show, reviews, interviews, profiles tell us what to do, what to see with our limited time and our limited resources. So that's a very fundamental kind of service model of journalism that arts reporters and arts journalists do. But there's another aspect to it that I think is less well understood, and it's that a really healthy, critical culture in the arts in Australia helps improve arts, right? It's because artists, even if they deny this, let me tell you, they all say that they don't engage with reviews and criticism. They all do, right? Artists, publishers, producers, broadcast networks, commissioning, editors, all of them engaged with the critical ecosystem. They benefit from seeing what people are responding to, what's working, what isn't, conversations and debates that are being sparked. Australia has had too many cop dramas. I think it would be great if we went to Redfern and talked to local community on the streets there and figured out to tell stories that have been left out of the small screen for so long. It's how you get shows like Redfern Now that win awards and create a new generation of storytellers. This is the important role that arts journalism plays in Australia. And then finally, there's the actual just investigative journalistic element of it.
Yeah.
Who runs arts institutions? What's really going on at Meanjin? Are the people running these organizations doing a good or bad job? Is there dodgy stuff happening behind the scenes? Are jobs being cut? Are donors influencing how theaters and how art galleries are running? The answer to most of these questions is yes. And it's arts journalists who tell us them. And that matters so much because it holds these people to account and can protect these institutions from kind of social and critical vandalism that goes on. If we don't have arts journalism, we just don't know what's been going on behind the scenes. And I don't need to tell you, Scott, or our listeners, that that's never been more important than in the past 2 years.
Totally. There's so much cultural vandalism happening that, right now there's all these cuts happening at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. That's a public institution that belongs to all of us, and we should know what's going on. Shout out to Judith Mitchell, who wrote a book about that 8 years ago, warning that this
Shout out, Judy.
Exactly what would happen. It's one of her best productions, as well as being my mother. But we need accountability on those institutions. I'll be totally honest. I rarely read culture pages. I know that makes me a Luddite and an idiot. I just never have. I've never really read reviews and artist profiles.
You've got me in your life, man. You
I know, I've got you. But I guess if some of our listeners or whatever also don't, it's I'm exactly like you. I think the reason I care about this story so much is what you mentioned about the people. It's the culture pages are often where the most interesting, exciting writing happens, and the people who cut their teeth doing that have made some of my favorite TV shows, movies, books, are written by people who started writing in culture pages. If anyone doesn't believe me, if you like Black Mirror, the creator of that show, Charlie Brooker, was an incredible culture writer for years and years before that and made his living doing culture writing. My personal hero, John Ronson, started out writing for Time Out before he became a worldwide best-selling author. Without arts coverage, that conveyor belt of talent, doesn't exist. And that's what makes me fired up and really sad about this.
Yeah, and that conveyor belt of talent is just so diminished in Australia now. We talked about the big issue cutting back its reviews. Meanjin's gone. The ABC's gutted its arts team. The Age and Sydney Morning Herald no longer have a dedicated culture editor, a literary editor, or a dedicated music writer. And there is still very good arts journalism being done at those papers. In particular, I think the Herald and the Age still have more arts journalism than basically anywhere else, but it's undeniable that it's diminished and not being given the resources and prominence that it once was. The Guardian has a dedicated arts team. I mean, it's small, but they continue to cover Australian arts and they do local TV and film reviews as well. People might jump in and say, Schwartz at the Monthly and the Saturday Paper do arts coverage too, and it does, but I think there's been some pretty high-profile examples recently of TV reviews, Patrick Marlborough has written about this. His review for Andor was spiked because they discussed Gaza and the parallels in that show, and let me tell you, those parallels absolutely exist, so it's hard to sort of look there for positive signs. And there's another side to this, Scott, which is aren't podcasts and newsletters and Substacks picking up the gap here? And I'll be honest, I listen to so many podcasts about music, TV, and film coming out of the US, and they do a really amazing job of keeping me informed and giving me really interesting takes about all of that stuff. But what they don't cover is anything Australian, and Australian music, Australian TV, Australian film, Australian visual arts, needs these conversations. It is such a symbiotic relationship. So when people talk about how Australian TV isn't as good as it used to be, or where are the good Australian films, or why does Australian literature feel like it's in this funk, we're not going to get past that without a really healthy, robust arts media ecosystem, in my view.
Totally. It accelerates this globalization, which is honestly more just American cultural dominance. And we're producing, whether it's what I discussed before, the writers side of it, we're producing less and less writers who cut their teeth writing these articles. We're covering the Australian art, music, and culture less to the public, so people know less about it. And if you want to live in a world where kids in this country can dream of being film directors or making music or writing books, gutting arts journalism is a good way to make sure that doesn't happen anymore.
Totally. So, I mean, is anything positive happening in Australia? And partly, I think to an extent, some of what the mainstream media is abandoning is being picked up by newsletters and podcasters and YouTubers. I think on the show I've mentioned Derek G before. This is an Australian music focused creator. He's got over 750,000 Instagram followers, right? So that's like a huge audience for an Australian talking about music. And there's plenty of Substacks doing reviews and interviews and stuff as well. I think that's really exciting, but I also think there's limitations to that, right? Like, you don't have genuine, like, commercial independence. You're sort of at the whims of so many big, you know, whether they're distributors or producers or labels. Your access is kind of dictating how you cover a lot of stuff. You don't have editors. You don't have colleagues to kind of bounce these things off. You don't have a model that is like sustainable economically, which just kind of like limits your ability to be really critical. I don't want to say that you should ignore all of that stuff. I mean, we're trying to do some of this stuff. And honestly, man, if we had more resources, I've talked to you about this before, I'd love to like build out an arts and culture pillar. I used to have this podcast called The Culture that people still talk to me about because I think it just like did something that doesn't really exist in the Australian ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Derek G. Shout out Derek G. Love his stuff. We should also mention, like, as another example of kind of independent or like, you know, very digital first people like a friend of the show, Alexei Toliopoulos, and like incredible film critic doing this stuff.
Yeah, great show.
Outside of big publishers, and a lot of those people are fantastic. I think they would agree that they would want to see big legacy media and other outlets doing this stuff as well, because like aside from those kind of really great independents, you know, like there's also so many kind of like influencers and all kinds of other people who like might be less scrupulous, as you say, like get free tickets, get flown around, taken to dinner, like blah, blah, blah. Like, does that influence what gets covered by digital creators? We don't really know. Like, legacy media isn't squeaky clean on that either, Oz, but at least like in the heyday, there were, you know, there's editorial policies, there's editors, there's like eyes on things, there's some accountability and systems meant to prevent it and kind of like do those things. And I worry about the future if like we put all of our hopes on purely independent kind of online creators, as good as some of them are, and I hope they flourish.
Totally. And look, I think the last thing I want to say is I just don't believe that this stuff is genuinely economically unviable. I mean, people say that about all kinds of media. We're trying to prove, you know, we just like lamestream is that there is a sustainable path to like do news, break news, do analysis, like create really interesting content that people engage with on different platforms. And, you know, if we can prove it in this space, hopefully we can prove it in kind of other pillars as well. And I think that's like a long-term ambition of ours. All right, Scott, after the break, how the media coverage of Erin Patterson's trial impacted her sentence and the ever blurrier lines between influencers and journalists.
Oz, on Monday, the judge in the Erin Patterson case, Justice Christopher Beale, handed down his sentence. And it was historic, not just because of the murders and how much interest there has been in this case, but because Beale allowed cameras in to live broadcast his sentencing remarks for the first time in Victorian Supreme Court history. And I happened to be booked that morning on TV on Today Extra, talking to David Campbell and Sylvia Jeffries. Shout out to David and Sylvia, two of the good ones. But I was watching him speak and was going to go live after he finished to give some reaction. And just watching him, I was, you know, like we have talked on this show before about the risks of the way the media has given this case so much coverage. And you've been probably more critical of it than me, and we've disagreed a little bit about like when the media steps into doing actual damage. But I thought like in this sentencing, Justice Beale made like a very deliberate point of highlighting this as a factor. And I thought we should mention it this week as kind of a cap on everything we've discussed. He mentioned it while he was talking about the conditions that Patterson would have to be held in, because she's currently in like what amounts to be solitary confinement for her own protection, because prison authorities think like her fame means she's under significant threat of violence from other inmates, so she's held in solitary. At the moment, she's in her isolation cell for 22 hours a day and is fed through a flap in the door. She has to get approval to talk to any other prisoner in her confinement unit, which she can only do through a metal grate. She's been approved to speak to one other inmate, but she hasn't taken that up. There's like a tiny 2 by 1.5 meter yard adjoining her cell that she can access for fresh air, but has to kind of request and get permission. And like Justice Beale laid all this out and said that being held in those conditions, according to international law, should only be done for 15 days at a time. Patterson's already been held like that for 15 months, Oz, and will now spend at least 30 33 years in prison. Here's what Justice Beale said about how long she's likely to be held in this kind of solitary confinement. He said, quote, "Given the unprecedented media coverage of your case and the books, documentaries, and TV series about you, which are all in the pipeline, you are likely to remain a notorious prisoner for many years to come, and as such remain at significant risk from other prisoners." And he said there's a substantial chance this means she'll likely be held like this for years to come. Oz, like, it also affected his decision to give her parole after 33 years rather than never allowing the possibility of parole. And I just think like the way he laid this out made it really clear how like the media and public fascination and all this content being made, it has an actual material weight on the justice system. Like it brought all these conversations we've had home to me. What did you make of where we've ended up on all of this?
I feel extremely vindicated in like the vociferous kind of stance I took against the profiteering on this case. And I want to be really clear about that. Like, because so many people, man, like people in my life got mad and said, well, you know, we're just trying to understand how the justice system works and people have got an interest in this. I'm like less annoyed at individuals who consume this stuff than I am at giant media companies making millions and millions of dollars off their coverage of this. Vivian Kelly, running from Umbrella, pointed out something really interesting. Like when the judge was making those remarks you just read about how the unprecedented media coverage and the documentaries and TV series in the pipeline were impacting his kind of sentencing remarks, as the 9 papers, The Age and the SMH were carrying that feed, all around them were ads for Stan's upcoming documentary. So like, don't take the sides of giant publicly listed media companies whose attempts to report on this stuff for clicks and audiences, one, impacted the trial itself, right? And there still remain outstanding concerns around, you know, issues around how this stuff was reported and how it impacted the actual legal process. And now, two, the sentencing. Like, this stuff has an impact. It's not just happening in a kind of echo chamber. It is real stuff. And I think I'm pretty disappointed with how few elements of that media ecosystem who did this want to grapple with it at all. I just find that pretty unfathomable at this stage when it's been laid out in black and white. And I think the other thing to mention is so many of the victim impact statements in this trial also mentioned the negative impact that the media coverage had on them. And so these are the places that pretend they're speaking up for the victims, and the victims are saying, actually, this is really having a negative impact on us. I just think it's important to lay that stuff out there.
Yeah, like I think we could still have our quibbles, but I think like the thing you are totally justified in, like 100% justified in, is like there's no doubt to me hearing this that like the media, the delivery of justice would have all benefited from like asking themselves these questions, like having this conversation and asking about the impacts and when the media coverage of the trial did wrong. I think if those questions had been asked before the content was made, we might be in a better place. Like, to me, obviously, I'm getting into the realm of speculation here, which is difficult on legal cases. I think Justice Beale, obviously, he allowed the camera in. He knew the whole country and the world really would be watching this. And he had to get through a lot about the crime, about the premeditation, the lack of remorse. The fact that he chose to mention specifically like these TV shows and books that are in the works, the podcasts, all this kind of thing, I think he wanted the public to hear that all of this content doesn't come for free. Like, it does really affect the justice system. And that's my supposition. I'm not like speaking for him, but like, I think it's obvious that the content doesn't come for free. There is a real consequence, and like Patterson will now have to be imprisoned in these inhumane conditions for a long time, and she'll also get out probably sooner than she would have otherwise. Those are material consequences of the content.
Yeah, good on you for picking that up. I kind of wasn't following the sentencing too closely, but I'm glad that you clocked that. I'm glad that we are talking about it. Scott, last week, quite a few people sent me a TikTok of an Australian content creator who was very, very annoyed at a couple of podcasts that had taken aim at her. The influencer's name is Chloe Baradinsky, and I personally wasn't familiar with her work, but let's listen to a little bit of what she had to say.
Because it's a car, so I like you think the most absurd thing in the entire world. Someone commented and was like, you should listen to Big Small Talk podcast. So I did that last night. It was the first time. Glad I've never listened to it before, because clearly you can just get behind a microphone now and talk shit out of your fucking ass, because they didn't do any DD. It would have taken all of about 2 seconds for them to email me or DM. You want a DM? Fine. Asking, was my trip to Afghanistan sponsored or gifted? I would have said, are you out of your fucking mind? No. One, if you've been to Afghanistan, you would know that things are pretty dire right now. I don't think they've got money to be throwing around paying for influencers.
So, okay, that bit definitely got my attention, and I wanted to figure out what exactly was going on here. So what's happening is Baradinsky, who's got 140,000 followers on TikTok, last month posted a bunch of content from a trip she made to Afghanistan. Now, that trip did not go down well among some podcasters who were very perturbed that Baradinsky would go to Afghanistan at all, then post positively about it, and a couple of them even suggested without evidence that she was being paid by the Taliban to do it. Now, the podcaster Rosie Wadland on her Just the Gist podcast was the first to really criticize Chloe, and she went pretty hard on her. She accused her of being desperate for attention and claimed that she had cooperated with the Taliban to make that content. But most of Chloe's TikTok, where she was really fired up, most of her ire was reserved for the Big Small Talk podcast hosted by Cheek Media's Hannah Ferguson and Sarah Jane Adams, who she accused of misrepresenting her and making false allegations about her trip. This is interesting because this gets into this like quite thorny issue of when do influencers become journalists and what are the expectations and responsibilities they've got when they tell their big audiences something about another person. So I listened to the episode of Big Small Talk, and it was published on August 26th. It was an interesting conversation about the ethical dilemmas of influencers promoting Afghanistan as a destination right now because of its human rights record, particularly in regards to women. Let's listen to a little bit about what they had to say.
It might surprise you to hear that traveling to Afghanistan as a woman is actually often safer than traveling as a man. Why? The things to watch out for in Afghanistan is not the government and what it controls, rather what it can't control. You're talking about the Taliban. Zoe, I have an overwhelming urge to yell at you. Also, after making a caption about how safe it is, she then also follows up with some safety advice. Just a few tips. Please dress modestly. If you're a woman, avoid any crowds. Do not post or make your location known in real-time posting. Like, do you hear yourself, Zoe? And then wild. Posted videos of women laughing as if that's like them consenting to the Taliban regime. These videos they're posting, these influencers, are then sort of taken multiple times by the Taliban and reshared. In another fucking ridiculous 50-second video that I found by a vlogger called Yusuf Orubi,
There's a lot of this stuff, Scott. A lot of presumption that anyone who would want to go to Afghanistan right now is apparently like a shill for the Taliban and is, politically compromised. And there was mocking this idea that people who go to a country like Afghanistan should be aware of risks and should even dress modestly or appropriately for that country and that culture. I kind of do think a little part of this is valid, like travel influencers can have hokey ethics and there's a lot of like poverty porn. There's a lot of people who are in cahoots with like terrible regimes. They're getting money. They're making content that often exploits like local communities who are pretty vulnerable. But there was a lot of this conversation, man, that left me very uncomfortable. This idea that because of Afghanistan's culture and its current government, it should just like never be visited by Western tourists. Anyone who goes there is evil and bad and promoting something terrible. I mean, the thing about dressing modestly, like I understand that that doesn't align with a kind of brand of Western liberal feminism politics, but you would just encourage that in countries from like India to the Middle East to the Vatican City, where you have to cover your legs when you go. And these are places visited by so many Australian tourists.
Yeah, this story is interesting to me because it sort of copy and pastes to me like controversies from the UK and the US where like tabloid media actually have gone after some travel influencers there who went to Afghanistan and slammed them. I also think there's kind of like, there is a genuine worry, but to me it's more about that all these stories kind of make young people think like, cool, I'll go to Afghanistan and do TikToks and become famous. And like, I don't know if that's a great idea. But on the other side of it, to your point, like I went to places when I was like 18 years old that people probably thought were a bad idea. Like I went to Syria at 18. I remember coming back and having had this like incredible eye-opening experience. A lot of people asking me questions. Obviously, this is pre the social media age in a lot of ways, but like, what did your parents think of you going to a place like that? Oh, so you're okay with like Bashar al-Assad? And I think it's pretty gross to like police politics and like, you know, make assumptions about kind of like cultures and those kind of things when like travel really is something far more human and nuanced and kind of enlightening than that, I think, than this kind of like cancellation behavior policing kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I think what is so interesting about the big small talk conversations when they turn to Baradinsky specifically, things are kind of confusing and weird because all the kind of issues that we've sort of flagged with doing this stuff, you know, like, are you describing the nuance of these things? Are you separating out the people and the culture from the government? Are you talking about the actual genuine safety risks there? They kind of all admitted that Baradinsky did a pretty good job of that. Like the videos were captioned with things like, I hope the video shows people a different side of the country beyond the headlines, and it shows a group of people that are kind and hospitable despite decades of war, right? And the big small talk hosts say, you know, she did talk about how she felt unsafe. She kept it pretty real. And she said that there's a lot of governments that we don't agree with, and you've got to be okay with kind of accepting that. So Baradinsky seemingly like did a decent job of all the kind of nuance that you were just sort of outlining, but it didn't really stop them from really going in on her. And where it got really interesting, Scott, is when they just kind of started speculating on her financial motivations. You know, they asked, is she being paid to go there? Is this a gifted trip? Is she potentially on a paid or supported influencer trip? And this comes after Rosie Waterland suggested that she was being paid by the Taliban. And this is specifically what Chloe got very fired up about on TikTok. She categorically denied being paid by the Taliban to go on the trip and says she wasn't sponsored or gifted the trip either. And she was furious in particular that no one asked her before making these claims. And at this stage, it might be worth revisiting what Waterland in particular had to say because it was pretty intense. Waterland says, imagine working in coordination with the Taliban. It's despicable. It's despicable. If you are an influencer who is coordinated with the Taliban to do fancy travel content from Afghanistan, you are a despicable person, right? It's pretty like intense stuff to say without having fact-checked whether that actually happened. So when Chloe responds and lays out the facts, how did the podcasters respond? Well, Rosie promptly deleted her episode, which I think is probably like a safe, ethical, and legal response. Big Small Talk, interestingly, they did a really extended segment on a follow-up episode discussing Chloe's criticism, and they acknowledged that some of Chloe's points were important for us to take on, and we appreciate the messages we've got. They also brought up the fact that a lot of people apparently messaged them attacking them because both the hosts of that show went to the US earlier this year and, pointed out that that is also a regime that is terrible in women's rights. And, Trump is displaying a lot of signs of fascistic authoritarianism. Interestingly, Hannah Ferguson, one of the hosts, said, it's something I've thought a lot about, and I actually agree. We won't return to the US under the regime of Donald Trump, but they think that that trip was distinct from Chloe's to Afghanistan. They also said that they did not suggest that Chloe's trip was paid directly to her by the Taliban, but added that we should not have assumed that she was supported. My favorite bit about this, Scott, is like this line when they're trying to deal with the criticism of the fact that they didn't ask Chloe or make inquiries as to who might have funded the trip. They said, the podcast is based in analysis and this is not investigative journalism, right? Which is a pretty extraordinary defense to, I guess, falsely alleging someone was paid off by the Taliban or implying that they might have been. And this brings me to like the bigger take on this stuff, right? And it's something we've talked about before a couple of times on the show. What is journalism? What is just a news influencer? What is analysis? The thing is, like, these kinds of podcasts are doing journalism. And you can keep saying that it isn't, but when you are bringing new information to your audience, when you're presenting facts and details, that is journalism. Even if you then analyze it, And even if you keep saying you're not doing journalism, from an ethical perspective, from a legal perspective, your responsibilities are the same. You've got to try to be as accurate as possible. And if you're going to make allegations about someone, you need to ask them for their response to it. The consequences are the same regardless of what you call it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me very quickly. I was on we didn't suggest, etc. It's sort of like putting a question mark at the end of something is such a kind of time-honored tactic that's used to kind of circumvent those responsibilities you mentioned. And but we all recognize that going is Anthony Albanese a criminal communist agent is wrong, right? But I just mean that to mention it seems to me what's sort of so weird as well about this influencer space is I think in journalism, if you'd been in a newsroom, if you sort of across that, you'd make a retraction. You'd just simply apologize and you'd fully retract all of that. You'd explain all of that, but just sort of go with oh no, we were just doing analysis. We're just asking these rhetorical questions. That is, we sort of that's fine, but we're now not going to go to the US. It sort of is this influencer world where everything is about personal behavior. And it's there's a way to address this, I think, in journalism where you would simply sort of fess up to it, own up, move on. The idea that then, now I'm going to police my behavior harder is a very strange way of dealing with controversy.
Yeah, and you're really right. It's not about the personal. It's not just about pointing out someone said something a bit silly on a podcast. There are really significant structural consequences and kind of points to be made about this. I've previously talked about the concerns I've got about this new news influencer sphere and how it's somehow weirdly become more white and more insular than the existing media landscape. I think the framing of how these podcasts talked about Afghanistan is an example of that. But then also, if you don't follow some of these straightforward journalistic principles, not only is there an ethical question, there's a legal one too. You can run afoul of defamation law, right? And that has consequences for everyone, even if you think you're doing the right thing. If you imply these kinds of things, if you create an easy opportunity for someone to engage the legal process to shut you down, that has a chilling effect for the rest of the media environment as well. And it's just not that hard to do these things. And I guess in that vein, we did reach out to both Chloe Baradinsky and Cheek Media. Chloe did not want to comment on this story. She said she sort of, wants to move past it. Cheek did not respond. If they do, we'll try to incorporate a response. Our researcher, Izzy Lewis, actually wrote a really interesting piece about all of this and did a lot of the legwork to kind of just piece together exactly what was said. You can read that by subscribing at lamestream.com. I just think it's really important to talk about these emerging tensions as they arise, because I think they are significant and can have bigger consequences than a lot of people think.
Absolutely. As we wrap up, we teased some big news at the start of the show. Do you want to do the honors and share it with our audience?
Oh, this is very exciting, Scott. We are expanding the show. We're going twice weekly. You excited?
I'm so excited. We're going twice weekly. We're going to have a show on Monday and keep our regular show on Thursday.
Yeah, Monday episodes will be a little bit shorter. They'll be a bit more news focused. Basically, we want to help you kick off your week knowing what's going on in Australia and across the world, and also kind of flag what we want you to keep an eye on during the week. And on Thursdays, we'll be back with our regular deep dives as we've been doing. This all kicks off from next Monday. You excited?
I'm very excited. There's just too much to talk about to fit into this show. We promise that it's going to be kind of a different show. It's going to be as you say, wrap of the big things happening at the start of the week. And the deep dive will be, as ever, on Thursday.
Very, very excited. That is it from us today. Remember to leave us a review or share the episode with a friend and subscribe at lamestream.com.au to help support the work that we do. Thank you to our producer, Bez, our researcher, Izzy. Thank you to our video editor, Lloyd Cuff. And we'll be back on Monday. Scott, see you then.
See you then, Oz. Absolutely. Oz, as we wrap up, we teased some big news at the start of the show. Do you want to do the honors and share it with our audience?
Oh, this is very exciting, Scott. We are expanding the show. We're going twice weekly. You excited?
I'm so excited. We're going twice weekly. We're going to have a show on Monday and keep our regular show on Thursday.
Yeah, Monday episodes will be a little bit shorter. They'll be a bit more news focused. Basically, we want to help you kick off your week knowing what's going on in Australia and across the world, and also kind of flag what we want you to keep an eye on during the week. And on Thursdays, we'll be back with our regular deep dives as we've been doing. This all kicks off from next Monday. You excited?
I'm very excited. There's just too much to talk about to fit into this show. We promise that it's going to be really tight, and it's going to be hopefully a sort of we promise that it's going to be kind of a different show. It's going to be as you say, wrap of like the big things happening at the start of the week. And the deep dive will be, as ever, on Thursday.
Very, very excited. That is it from us today. Remember to leave us a review or share the episode with a friend, and subscribe at lamestream.com.au to help support the work that we do. Thank you to our producer Bez, our researcher Izzy. Thank you to our video editor Lloyd Cuff, and we'll be back on Monday. Scott, see you then.
See you then, Oz.